Margaret O'Sullivan's hand froze mid-reach toward the bathroom light switch, her morning coffee forgotten on the counter behind her. The woman staring back from the mirror wasn't her. Couldn't be her. Where yesterday there had been nothing, a dark shadow now consumed half her left cheek like spilled ink on white paper. The coffee mug slipped from her trembling fingers, porcelain exploding against tile in a symphony of destruction that matched the chaos erupting in her chest. Her husband Bob's heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, boots slipping on hardwood in his panic. 25 years of teaching had prepared her for unruly students, difficult parents, even budget cuts. But nothing had prepared her for the stranger wearing her face. She touched the mirror's surface, watching her reflection's fingers meet hers, both women equally lost. "Maggie, what happened? Are you—" Bob's voice died as he appeared in the doorway. What was happening to her? And how long did she have before everyone else saw what she'd become? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The small town of Cedar Creek, Texas had been Margaret O'Sullivan's entire world for 28 years of marriage and 25 years of shaping young minds at Riverside High School. Population 8,500, where everybody knew everybody's business, and secrets lasted about as long as morning dew in August heat. The kind of place where Friday night football games drew more crowds than the county fair, and where Maggie's English classroom had become a sanctuary for 3 generations of students who needed someone to believe in them. At 52, Maggie had the kind of face that belonged in Norman Rockwell paintings, warm brown eyes that crinkled when she smiled, silver-streaked auburn hair she kept in a practical bob, and laugh lines earned from decades of teenage jokes and literary discussions. She was the teacher students remembered long after graduation, the one who saw potential in the troublemakers and coaxed brilliance from the shy ones hiding in back rows. Her husband, Robert Bob O'Sullivan, was cut from the same sturdy cloth that built America's backbone. At 54, his construction-calloused hands told stories of honest work, while his steady blue eyes reflected the unwavering loyalty that had carried them through 28 years of marriage. Bob's construction crew respected him, his neighbors trusted him, and his wife adored the way he still brought her wildflowers from roadside ditches, claiming they were prettier than anything from the florist because they chose to bloom where they were planted. Their modest ranch house sat on Maple Street, where the mortgage payments stretched their teacher and tradesman budget thin, but where memories filled every corner. The living room still held Bob's recliner with the worn armrest and Maggie's reading chair by the window, where countless student papers had been graded under the soft glow of her grandmother's lamp. Wedding photos from 1995 smiled from the mantel, 2 young people who'd promised to love each other through better or worse, though neither had imagined worse might wear such a strange disguise. The house held echoes of dreams deferred, travel brochures for European river cruises tucked in Maggie's jewelry box, Bob's fishing magazine stacked neatly beside his toolbox, both of them quietly calculating whether their retirement savings would stretch far enough for the adventures they'd promised themselves someday. Their greatest heartbreak lived in the silence of the spare bedroom, where baby furniture had once waited for children who never came. Instead, Maggie had poured her maternal instincts into her students, and Bob had learned to love them as extensions of the family they'd never quite completed. Cedar Creek's residents went to church on Sundays, volunteered at school fundraisers, and believed in taking care of their own. The O'Sullivans were woven into the fabric of community life, Maggie coaching the academic decathlon team, Bob helping with Habitat for Humanity builds, both of them fixtures at every high school graduation ceremony where Maggie would tear up watching her kids receive their diplomas. In a town where reputation mattered and appearances counted, where gossip traveled faster than Sunday dinner invitations, the O'Sullivans had built a life of quiet respectability and genuine love. Until the morning everything changed. Monday morning arrived with the cruel normalcy of alarm clocks and coffee makers, as if the universe hadn't noticed that Margaret O'Sullivan's world had tilted off its axis. She stood in her bathroom, fluorescent light harsh against the mirror's unforgiving surface, staring at what she'd hoped might have been a nightmare. The dark spot on her left cheek had grown overnight, no longer the size of a dime but spreading like spilled wine on white linen, its edges irregular and defiant against her pale Irish skin. "Maybe it's just dirt," she whispered to her reflection, though the words tasted like lies. She'd scrubbed at it the night before with everything from soap to makeup remover, watching Bob's worried face in the mirror behind her as he pretended to read his construction magazine. Neither of them had slept well, both stealing glances at each other in the darkness, questions hanging between them like cobwebs they were afraid to brush away. The concealer felt thick and foreign as she applied layer after layer, transforming her morning routine into an act of desperate artistry. Foundation, powder, more concealer. Each application a small prayer that maybe, just maybe, she could make it through one more day of normal. The woman in the mirror wore a mask now, literally and figuratively, and Maggie wondered if this was how actors felt when they prepared for roles they never auditioned for. Riverside High School buzzed with its usual Monday morning energy as Maggie navigated the familiar hallways, her teacher's bag heavy with ungraded essays and lesson plans that suddenly felt surreal. How could she discuss the themes of identity and Romeo and Juliet when she no longer recognized herself? The fluorescent corridor lights seemed harsher than usual, and she found herself unconsciously angling her face away from passing colleagues, offering quick smiles and hurried greetings. "Morning, Mrs. O'Sullivan!" Grace Chen's voice carried its usual warmth, but Maggie caught the slight hesitation, the way the girl's eyes lingered on her face a beat too long. Grace was her star student, sharp enough for Harvard but trapped by her family's financial limitations, the kind of kid who reminded Maggie why she'd chosen teaching over more lucrative careers. "Good morning, sweetheart. Ready for our discussion on fate versus free will today?" Maggie's voice sounded normal to her own ears, a small victory that felt monumental. By third period, the concealer had begun to betray her. She caught her reflection in the classroom window between lessons and watched her heart sink as the dark patch showed through her careful camouflage like a shadow refusing to stay hidden. Her sophomore English class filed in with their usual combination of sleepy resistance and reluctant curiosity, backpacks dragging and phones quickly disappearing into pockets. "All right, scholars, let's talk about Act Two," Maggie began, falling into the rhythm that had sustained her for 25 years. Romeo climbs Juliet's balcony, defying danger for love. What does Shakespeare tell us about the lengths people will go to for what they believe in? Tommy Jefferson, the class clown who sat in the back row and thought he was invisible, raised his hand, unusual enough to catch Maggie's attention. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, are you feeling okay? You look—" He squinted, leaning forward in his desk. The classroom fell silent with the particular hush that teenage audiences reserved for moments when the adult world showed cracks. Maggie felt every pair of eyes on her face, studying the imperfection she'd tried so hard to hide. Her hands moved instinctively to her cheek, fingers finding the raised edges of what no amount of makeup could fully conceal. "I'm fine, Tommy. Just tired." Now, about Romeo's motivation. But her voice carried the tremor of someone trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. Grace raised her hand, her expression soft with concern. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, maybe you should see the nurse. That looks like it might hurt." 28 pairs of teenage eyes focused on the growing darkness that had claimed territory on their teacher's face overnight. Maggie saw her own fear reflected in their expressions, Not malicious, but uncomfortable in the way young people became when forced to confront adult vulnerability. It's nothing, really, just a reaction to something. Let's focus on our lesson. But even as she spoke, Maggie could feel the makeup sliding away under the classroom's warm air, revealing more of the mystery that had invaded her face like an unwelcome tenant. The bell rang with merciful timing, and students gathered their belongings with the subtle awkwardness of people who'd witnessed something they couldn't name. Grace lingered by Maggie's desk as the others filed out. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," she said quietly, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her 16 years. "My mom always says that when our bodies try to tell us something, we should listen. Maybe you should talk to someone who knows about these things." Standing alone in her empty classroom, surrounded by posters of literary heroes who'd faced their own monsters, Maggie touched her face and wondered if this was what it felt like when ordinary life began its transformation into something else entirely. By Wednesday morning, denial had become as impossible as hiding the sun behind a handkerchief. The dark patch on Margaret's face had spread overnight like spilled coffee on a white tablecloth, creeping down her cheek toward her jawline, with an persistence that made her stomach clench every time she caught her reflection in unexpected surfaces: store windows, car mirrors, the back of spoons. Bob had stopped pretending not to notice. She'd caught him staring at her over his morning coffee, his weathered hands gripping the mug like an anchor while his blue eyes held a mixture of worry and helplessness that made her chest tight. They'd been married 28 years, long enough to communicate in glances and sighs, long enough for her to recognize the particular way his jaw set when he was preparing for a difficult conversation. "Maggie," he said finally, setting down his cup with the deliberate care of a man choosing his words. "We need to talk about this." She turned away from the kitchen window where she'd been watching their neighbor Mrs. Patterson walk her ancient beagle, focusing on the ordinary Tuesday morning ritual to avoid the extraordinary reality spreading across her face. "There's nothing to talk about, Bob. It's probably just some kind of allergic reaction. You know how sensitive my skin gets." "To what?" His voice carried the patient tone he used when explaining construction problems to difficult clients. "When's the last time you used a new soap, new makeup, ate something different?" This didn't come from nowhere, Maggie. The questions hung between them like smoke from a fire neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Maggie's fingers found her cheek automatically, tracing the raised edges where normal skin gave way to something else entirely. The texture felt foreign under her fingertips, not painful exactly, but wrong in a way that made her want to scrub at it until she found herself underneath. "Maybe it's stress," she offered weakly, though they both knew their lives, while not easy, weren't particularly stressful by modern standards. Budget tight but manageable, marriage solid, job secure. The kind of middle-class problems that felt luxurious compared to what some of their neighbors faced. Bob's chair scraped against the linoleum as he pushed back from the table, crossing to where she stood frozen by the window. His calloused hands found her shoulders, turning her gently to face him. "Honey, look at me." When she finally met his eyes, she saw her own fear reflected there, magnified by love. "This isn't going away on its own. Whatever this is, we face it together, okay?" But we can't fight what we don't understand. That afternoon, Maggie's carefully constructed normalcy crumbled completely during fourth period advanced placement literature. She was discussing the symbolism in The Scarlet Letter, explaining how Hawthorne used physical marks to represent internal shame when she noticed the subtle shift in her students' attention. Their eyes weren't on their books anymore, weren't on the whiteboard where she'd written discussion questions in her careful teacher handwriting. They were staring at her face. Sarah Martinez, one of her brightest seniors, raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, are you sure you're feeling okay? That mark looks like it's gotten bigger." The classroom fell into the particular silence that teenage audiences reserved for moments when the adult world showed cracks they weren't prepared to handle. Maggie's hand moved instinctively to her cheek, fingers finding what her morning concealer could no longer hide. Through the classroom windows, afternoon sunlight revealed what artificial lighting had mercifully obscured. The dark patch now covered nearly a quarter of her face, its edges irregular and undeniably growing. "I'm fine," she said automatically, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Let's focus on Chapter 12, where Hester, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Grace Chen's voice cut through the pretense with the gentle authority of someone who'd learned to speak truth to power. "With respect, ma'am, you're not fine. And pretending you are doesn't help any of us learn what you're trying to teach us about courage and honesty." The 17-year-old's words hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. Here she was, teaching literature's greatest lessons about facing truth and finding strength in vulnerability, while literally covering her face to hide from her own reality. A phone buzzed, then another. In the modern teenage ecosystem, news traveled faster than wildfire, and Maggie watched her students' faces as text messages began flying between devices. She could almost see the photographs being taken, shared, discussed in digital spaces she'd never access. By the time the bell rang, her personal crisis would be public knowledge. The final straw came during her planning period, when Principal Thompson knocked on her classroom door with the expression of a man carrying bad news. Bill had been her friend for 15 years, had hired her fresh from her previous district, had celebrated every one of her teaching awards and student achievements. Now he stood in her doorway looking like he'd aged a decade since morning. "Maggie, we need to talk." He closed the door behind him and took the student desk across from hers, a gesture that somehow made the conversation feel both more serious and more personal. "I've had 12 calls from parents in the last hour. They're asking questions I can't answer." Her heart sank like a stone dropped in deep water. What kind of questions? The kind that start with, "Is it contagious?" and end with, "Should my child be in school?" Bill's voice carried the exhaustion of a man caught between friendship and professional responsibility. "I know you, Maggie. I know you'd never put students at risk, but I don't know what we're dealing with here, and neither do you." The weight of 25 years of teaching, of relationships built with thousands of students, of a reputation earned through patience and dedication, pressed down on her shoulders. "So what are you saying, Bill?" "I'm saying maybe you should take some time. Get answers. For your sake, and for everyone else's peace of mind." His words were gentle, but they carried the finality of a door closing. "I can get substitute coverage through the end of the week. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." Walking to her car through the familiar parking lot she'd navigated thousands of times, Maggie felt like a stranger in her own life. The waiting room at Cedar Creek Family Medical smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, its beige walls decorated with faded posters about hand washing and flu prevention. Margaret sat in a plastic chair that had seen too many worried patients, her fingers worrying the strap of her purse while Bob filled out insurance forms with the methodical precision of a man trying to control what little he could. The copay alone, $35, represented groceries they'd have to stretch, but some things couldn't be ignored anymore. Dr. Martinez had been their family physician for 8 years, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd guided them through Bob's back injury and Maggie's occasional bouts with seasonal allergies. He entered the examination room with the same gentle authority he'd always carried, but Maggie caught the slight pause when he first saw her face, the professional mask slipping for just a moment before sliding back into place. "Let's take a look," he said, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. His examination was thorough. probing the darkened skin with careful fingers, checking her lymph nodes, asking questions about pain levels, recent changes in diet or medication, family history. The dark patch felt raised under his touch, its texture different from the surrounding skin in ways that made both doctor and patient uncomfortable. Any itching, burning sensation, changes in vision or hearing? Dr. Martinez made notes in her chart, his pen moving steadily across the page as if documentation could somehow contain what they were witnessing. "No pain at all," Maggie replied, which seemed to worry him more than if she'd complained of agony. "It just appeared and keeps growing." After 20 minutes of examination and questioning, Dr. Martinez leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who'd reached the limits of his expertise. "I'm going to start you on a course of antibiotics and a topical steroid cream. Sometimes these kinds of skin reactions can be caused by bacterial infections or severe allergic responses. But I want to see you back in a week, and if there's no improvement, or if it continues to spread, we'll need to consider seeing a specialist." The prescription cost $48 at the pharmacy, money that came from the envelope marked "groceries" in Maggie's careful household budget. That evening, she applied the cream with religious devotion, Bob watching from their bedroom doorway as she stood before the bathroom mirror, trying to will the medication to work through sheer desperation. By Saturday morning, it was clear that hope and hydrocortisone weren't enough. The dark area had crept down her neck, its irregular borders making her look like someone had spilled ink down her face while she slept. Bob found her crying in the kitchen, still in her nightgown at 10 in the morning, staring at her reflection in the chrome surface of their coffee pot. "It's not working," she whispered, her voice small and lost in their familiar kitchen. "Nothing's working." Bob's arms came around her from behind, his chin resting on the top of her head in a gesture that had comforted her through 1,000 smaller crises. But this wasn't small, and they both knew it. "We'll figure this out, Maggie. I promise you, we'll figure this out." The community response began slowly, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Mrs. Patterson from next door stopped by with a casserole and carefully averted eyes, her usual cheerful chatter replaced by uncomfortable silence. At the grocery store, Maggie noticed how conversations stopped when she passed, how familiar faces turned away or studied their shopping lists with sudden intensity. The first real blow came from an unexpected source. Maggie's sister Catherine called from Dallas on Sunday afternoon, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Maggie, honey, I saw the pictures." "Pictures?" Maggie's stomach clenched, though she already knew what Catherine meant. In the age of smartphones and social media, privacy was as extinct as dinosaurs. "Some of your students posted them online." "It's... God, Maggie, what is that? Mom's been calling me all morning, scared out of her mind. She wants to know if she should fly down." The knowledge that images of her face were circulating on the internet, being shared and discussed by strangers, hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere out there, teenagers were forwarding photos of their English teacher's mysterious condition, probably with commentary she didn't want to imagine. "Tell Mom I'm fine," Maggie lied smoothly, though her hands were shaking as she gripped the phone. "It's just some kind of allergic reaction. The doctor's handling it." But Catherine wasn't fooled. "Allergic to what, Maggie? When's the last time you tried something new, went somewhere different, changed anything in your routine? This doesn't look like any allergy I've ever seen." The questions Catherine asked were the same ones that kept Maggie awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Bob's steady breathing reminded her that at least one of them could still find peace in sleep. What could cause something like this? Why wasn't it responding to treatment? And the question she was most afraid to voice: what if it never stopped spreading? Monday brought a phone call that changed everything. Principal Thompson's voice carried the weight of difficult decisions and sleepless nights. Maggie, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to take extended leave until we know what we're dealing with. The district office got involved after the school board meeting last night. School board meeting? Maggie's voice came out smaller than she intended. Emergency session. Packed house, parents demanding answers about whether their children have been exposed to something contagious. I tried to explain that you're seeing doctors, that there's no evidence of any infectious disease, but Bill's sigh carried the exhaustion of a man caught between friendship and professional survival. They're talking about bringing in the health department. There's even been mention of closing the school for deep cleaning. The weight of 25 years of teaching, of relationships built with thousands of students, of a reputation earned through patience and dedication, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She thought of her advanced placement students, just months away from college applications and final exams, now disrupted by their teacher's mysterious affliction. "How long?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be indefinite. "Until you have a clear diagnosis and medical clearance." "I'm sorry, Maggie. I really am. But my hands are tied." After hanging up, Maggie sat in her quiet house and calculated the financial reality of unpaid leave. Without her teacher's salary, they'd have exactly 6 weeks before missing their first mortgage payment. Bob's construction work was seasonal and unpredictable. Good money when the weather cooperated and projects were available, but nothing resembling the steady income her teaching had provided for over 2 decades. The dermatology referral came with a 3-week waiting list and a specialist consultation fee that made Bob's face go pale when he called for the appointment. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes practiced in the county seat, 40 miles away, and her earliest available appointment was February 15th, nearly a month away. "We can't wait a month," Bob said after hanging up the phone. "Look at how fast it's spreading." But the alternative, paying for an immediate consultation without insurance pre-approval, carried a price tag that would drain their savings account and max out their credit card. They were trapped between medical necessity and financial reality, a position familiar to millions of American families, but no less devastating for its commonality. That night, Maggie found herself standing in her bathroom again, studying her reflection by the harsh fluorescent light that revealed every detail she'd rather ignore. The dark patch now covered almost half her face and was creeping steadily downward, its edges irregular and seemingly random in their progression. She looked like someone had taken a paintbrush dipped in shadows and started a portrait they'd never finish. Behind her in the mirror, she could see Bob in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of their bed with his head in his hands. 28 years of marriage had taught her to read his postures like a familiar book, and right now every line of his body spoke of a man carrying burdens he couldn't share. The overtime shifts he'd been picking up, the way he'd started calculating expenses down to the penny, the conversations he ended abruptly when she entered the room, all signs of financial pressure he was trying to shield her from. The bottle of sleeping pills in their medicine cabinet seemed to whisper possibilities she didn't want to acknowledge. Not suicide exactly, but the kind of thoughts that crept in during 3 a.m. darkness when problems seemed insurmountable and solutions felt like fairy tales. What if this never stopped? What if it covered her entire body? What if the financial strain destroyed their marriage the way medical bills destroyed so many others? She touched the mirror's surface, watching her reflection's fingers meet hers, both women looking lost and afraid. Somewhere in Cedar Creek, her students were attending classes with substitute teachers, probably discussing their former English teacher's mysterious condition in whispers and text messages. Somewhere in the school district offices, administrators were writing incident reports and consulting with lawyers about liability issues. Somewhere in their community, friends and neighbors were avoiding the O'Sullivan house like it carried a plague. But here in this small bathroom, in this modest house they might lose, Margaret O'Sullivan was just a woman who no longer recognized herself, married to a man who loved her enough to pretend he wasn't scared, facing a mystery that was testing every assumption they'd ever made about their quiet, predictable life. The face in the mirror stared back with dark eyes that held the same question she'd been asking for days. What happens when your ordinary life becomes extraordinary, and you don't know if you're strong enough for the story you're being forced to live? The emergency appointment with Dr. Elizabeth Hayes cost $450 that Bob withdrew from their dwindling savings account without telling Maggie the exact amount. She sat in the passenger seat of their 15-year-old pickup truck, a scarf wrapped around her neck and lower face like a woman hiding from winter weather in the middle of February's mild Texas afternoon. Every stoplight felt like a spotlight, every glance from other drivers like an accusation. Dr. Hayes's office occupied the top floor of a medical building that smelled like expensive carpet and professional success. The waiting room magazines were current, the furniture was real wood instead of plastic, and the other patients looked like people who could afford to be there. Maggie felt the familiar shame of economic disparity, the way her teacher's salary and Bob's calloused hands marked them as different from the well-dressed couples discussing insurance coverage and vacation plans. When Dr. Hayes finally called them into her consultation room, Maggie braced herself for the same routine they'd experienced with Dr. Martinez. Gentle probing, concerned expressions, and ultimately the admission that medical science had limits. But Dr. Hayes was different. She was younger than Maggie had expected, maybe mid-40s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a professional bun and eyes that held the particular intensity of someone accustomed to solving puzzles other doctors couldn't crack. "Tell me everything," Dr. Hayes said, settling into her chair with the focused attention of someone who had time to listen. "Start from the very beginning. Don't leave out any detail that seems unimportant, and don't try to self-diagnose. I want to hear exactly what you experienced and when." For 20 minutes, Maggie recounted the progression of her condition while Dr. Hayes took notes in precise handwriting, asking follow-up questions that revealed a depth of knowledge that both comforted and worried her. The examination that followed was more thorough than anything she'd experienced. Photographs taken from multiple angles, measurements recorded, the texture and temperature of the affected skin assessed with instruments Maggie couldn't name. "I want to run several tests," Dr. Hayes said finally, pulling off her examination gloves with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions. "Blood work, tissue biopsy, some imaging studies. This isn't typical of anything I've seen in 15 years of dermatology practice, which means we need to be thorough." The word biopsy hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Bob's hand found Maggie's across the examination table, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become their anchor through 28 years of marriage. "What are you thinking it might be?" Bob asked, his construction worker's directness cutting through medical politeness. Dr. Hayes paused, clearly weighing how much uncertainty she should share with patients who were already frightened. "There are several possibilities we need to rule out. Some are more serious than others. That's why we need the tests. So we're treating facts instead of guesses." The laboratory work required 3 vials of blood and a small tissue sample that Dr. Hayes removed with local anesthetic and careful precision. The biopsy site would heal, she explained, but the test results would take a week to process. The total cost for everything, consultation, lab work, pathology analysis, came to $875, a number that made Bob's face go pale despite his efforts to hide his reaction. "Insurance should cover most of this," the billing coordinator explained with the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered financial bad news regularly. "You'll probably have a copay of around $200 once everything processes." But Maggie had been teaching long enough to understand bureaucracy, and Bob had been dealing with contractors long enough to know that should and will were different words for important reasons. They paid the full amount up front, Bob's signature on the credit card receipt carrying the weight of money they didn't really have. The drive home passed in silence, broken only by the truck's familiar rattles and the distant sound of Bob's country music station playing songs about heartbreak and resilience. Maggie watched the familiar landscape of their county roll past. Farmland giving way to subdivisions, strip malls anchored by dollar stores and fast food restaurants. The geography of American middle-class life lived paycheck to paycheck. $875, Bob said finally, his voice carrying the flat tone he used when calculating material costs for construction jobs. And that's just to find out what questions to ask next. Maggie turned to study her husband's profile, noting the new lines around his eyes and the way his jaw muscles twitched when he was calculating problems he couldn't solve with hard work and determination. "Bob, maybe we should—" "No." His interruption was gentle but firm. "Whatever you're about to suggest that involves giving up or going without treatment, the answer is no. We've been married 28 years, Maggie. We've survived my back injury, your father's cancer, the year I was unemployed after the construction company folded. We'll survive this too." But that night, Maggie heard him on the phone in their kitchen, his voice carrying the particular tone he used when discussing money with his brother Danny in Houston. She couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was familiar, the rhythm of a proud man asking for help he didn't want to need. When he returned to their bedroom, his expression carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent his pride like currency. The community's response continued to evolve in ways that revealed the complex nature of small-town relationships. Mrs. Patterson still brought casseroles, but she left them on the porch instead of coming inside for coffee and gossip. At the grocery store, checkout clerks who'd known Maggie for years suddenly discovered urgent tasks that required them to look everywhere except her face. The pharmacist who'd filled her prescriptions for nearly a decade now wore gloves when handling her medication bottles, a precaution that spoke louder than words. But kindness persisted in unexpected places. Grace Chen appeared at their front door on Saturday afternoon, carrying a stack of books and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd made a decision adults might not approve of. "I brought your assignments from AP Lit," she said, settling into Maggie's living room chair as if mysterious skin conditions were perfectly normal topics for teenage Saturday afternoon visits. "Grace, honey, you probably shouldn't—" Maggie began, but the 17-year-old's raised hand stopped her mid-sentence. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, with respect, that's the kind of thinking that keeps people isolated when they need community most. You taught us about moral courage in literature. Now seems like a good time to practice it in real life." Grace opened her notebook with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to taking charge. "Besides, I have questions about the Transcendentalism Unit and Mr. Peterson doesn't explain Emerson nearly as well as you do." For an hour they discussed Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay Self-Reliance and its themes of individual conscience versus social conformity, the irony not lost on any of them. Grace's presence in their living room felt like a small act of rebellion against the fear that was slowly quarantining Maggie from her normal life. "The other students ask about you," Grace said as she prepared to leave. "Not all of them, but more than you might think. Jenny Morrison said she misses your discussions about symbolism in The Great Gatsby. Marcus Johnson actually asked when you're coming back. And you know Marcus never voluntarily discusses English class." After Grace left, Maggie found herself crying for the first time since her diagnosis, not from fear or frustration, but from the overwhelming gratitude of being seen as human rather than medical mystery. One student's courage had reminded her that she was still Margaret O'Sullivan, beloved teacher and trusted mentor, regardless of what was happening to her face. That evening, Bob found her grading Grace's latest essay at their kitchen table, red pen moving across the pages with the familiar rhythm of 25 years of teaching. "You know you don't have to do that," he said, settling into the chair across from her with a cup of coffee and the careful movements of someone whose body carried decades of physical labor. "I know," Maggie replied, not looking up from Grace's analysis of civil disobedience in Thoreau's Walden. But maybe I need to. Maybe staying connected to who I am is more important than protecting other people from what I'm becoming. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Dr. Hayes called personally, her voice carrying an urgency that made Maggie's chest tight with anticipation and dread. "I need you to come in immediately." "Can you be here within the hour? The test results?" Maggie's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Yes, and they're unexpected. We need to discuss treatment options immediately, and there are some questions I need to ask you that I should have asked during our first appointment. Can your husband come with you?" Hanging up the phone, Maggie stared at Bob across their kitchen table, both of them understanding that their quiet Saturday morning had just become the pivot point of their lives. Whatever Dr. Hayes had discovered, whatever truth was hidden in laboratory reports and pathology slides, was about to transform their understanding of everything they'd experienced over the past 3 weeks. "Ready?" Bob asked, reaching for his truck keys with the steady calm he'd always shown in moments of crisis. Maggie touched her face one last time, feeling the raised texture of skin that no longer belonged to the woman she used to be. Then nodded. "Let's go find out what we're really fighting." Dr. Hayes's office felt different this time, the air heavier, the professional calm more forced, the way spaces change when they become the setting for life-altering conversations. She closed the door behind them with the deliberate care of someone who understood the weight of privacy, then settled behind her desk with a manila folder thick enough to contain weeks of worry condensed into medical terminology. "The tests revealed something I wasn't expecting," Dr. Hayes began, her professional composure intact, but her eyes holding the particular intensity of someone delivering news that would reshape everything. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, are you currently taking any medications? Anything at all, even over-the-counter supplements or vitamins?" Maggie's stomach clenched with a sensation that had nothing to do with the question itself and everything to do with the way it was asked, carefully, deliberately, like someone approaching a sleeping animal that might bolt. "Just the usual things. Multivitamin, calcium supplement, nothing else?" "Are you sure?" Dr. Hayes leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying the gentle insistence of someone who suspected they weren't getting the complete truth. "Because what I'm seeing in your blood work and tissue analysis suggests exposure to a very specific type of medication, something that would only be prescribed for serious medical conditions." The silence that followed felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Bob's hand found Maggie's across the space between their chairs, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had anchored them through 28 years of marriage. She could feel his confusion radiating like heat, the way he was trying to make sense of a conversation that seemed to be about someone else entirely. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, Doctor." Hayes continued, her voice softening with the kind of professional compassion reserved for moments when medical expertise met human frailty. "The skin changes you're experiencing are a known side effect of a class of drugs called tyrosine kinase inhibitors. They're used primarily in cancer treatment, specifically for certain types of breast cancer. The hyperpigmentation pattern, the timing, the progression, it all matches perfectly with what we see in patients undergoing targeted chemotherapy." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Maggie felt the world tilt sideways, her carefully constructed reality crumbling like a house built on sand. Bob's grip on her hand tightened, his construction worker's strength suddenly fragile in the face of truths he couldn't build or fix or solve with honest labor. "Cancer?" Bob's voice cracked on the word, years of steadiness fracturing in a single syllable. "What are you talking about?" "Maggie doesn't have cancer. She would have told me. We don't keep secrets. We don't—" "Bob?" Maggie's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through his protests like a blade through cloth. She turned to face her husband, seeing her own fear reflected and magnified in his blue eyes, and felt the weight of 6 months of deception pressing down on her like a physical burden. The confession poured out of her in broken sentences and desperate explanations. The routine mammogram last August that had found something suspicious, the biopsy that confirmed early-stage breast cancer, the oncologist's recommendation for oral chemotherapy that could be taken at home, discreetly, without disrupting their lives more than necessary, the insurance approval that had seemed like a miracle at the time, the careful choreography of taking medication when Bob was at work, hiding side effects behind seasonal allergies and middle-age fatigue. 6 months, Bob repeated, his voice hollow with betrayal and disbelief. 6 months you've been fighting cancer and you didn't tell me. How could you not tell me? I was protecting you, Maggie said, though the words sounded inadequate even to her own ears. Protecting us. You were already worried about the seasonal slowdown in construction work, about money, about everything. I thought I could handle it quietly, take the medication, beat it without turning our whole lives upside down. You thought you'd fight cancer alone. Bob's interruption carried the weight of 28 years of partnership suddenly revealed as incomplete. You thought I was too weak or too stupid or too something to be trusted with the truth about my own wife's life. Dr. Hayes cleared her throat gently, the sound of someone accustomed to mediating family crises that unfolded in medical offices. I understand this is a shock, but we need to focus on current treatment options. Mrs. O'Sullivan, how long have you been experiencing the skin changes? And more importantly, have you continued taking your prescribed medication? 3 weeks, Maggie replied, her voice steadier now that the secret was finally exposed to air and sunlight. And yes, I've been taking the pills exactly as prescribed. Every day, same time, never missed a dose. That's actually good news, Dr. Hayes said, making notes in the thick file. The hyperpigmentation is a sign that the medication is working, that your body is responding to treatment. It's alarming cosmetically, but medically it suggests the cancer cells are being targeted effectively. Bob leaned back in his chair as if someone had physically struck him, his weathered face cycling through emotions too complex for simple description. Betrayal, relief, anger, love, fear, all of it mixing together in the expression of a man whose understanding of his marriage had just been fundamentally altered. So the skin thing goes away? He asked finally, focusing on the one aspect of their situation that might have a concrete answer. Usually, yes, Dr. Hayes replied. The hyperpigmentation typically fades over several months after treatment is completed. But that brings us to the bigger question. Mrs. O'Sullivan, what's your current treatment timeline? When were you scheduled to finish the medication course? The answer came with a new wave of complications that made the skin changes seem simple by comparison. Maggie's treatment was supposed to continue for another 18 months, but the insurance company had recently denied coverage for continued therapy. Something about investigational use and cost-effectiveness parameters. Bureaucratic language that translated into a choice between cancer treatment and financial survival. How much? Bob asked, his voice carrying the flat tone he used when calculating costs for construction projects that exceeded his customers' budgets. For the remaining 18 months of treatment, Dr. Hayes consulted her computer screen with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering financial bad news alongside medical information. Approximately $180,000 without insurance coverage. The number landed between them like a physical object, too large and unwieldy to be processed immediately. Bob's face went through a series of calculations. Their teacher and construction worker salaries, their modest savings account, the equity in their house, the mathematics of ordinary people facing extraordinary expenses. There are assistance programs, Dr. Hayes continued quickly, recognizing the expression of people drowning in numbers they couldn't comprehend. Pharmaceutical companies sometimes offer compassionate use programs, and there are nonprofit organizations that help with cancer treatment costs. But I won't lie to you. It's a complicated process, and there are no guarantees. Maggie stared out the office window at the parking lot, where their 15-year-old pickup truck sat among newer, more expensive vehicles, thinking about the cruel irony of discovering that the thing destroying her appearance was actually saving her life, while the thing saving her life was about to destroy their financial future. "What happens if I stop taking the medication?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Dr. Hayes' expression grew serious in the way that medical professionals reserve for discussions about mortality. "Based on your pathology reports and current staging, I'd estimate 12 to 18 months before significant disease progression. Cancer rarely stays dormant without intervention. And with the medication? Excellent prognosis. 5-year survival rates in the 90% range for patients who complete the full treatment course." The choice laid itself out before them with mathematical brutality. Financial ruin or likely death, bankruptcy or burial, losing their house or losing each other. In the space between those options, 28 years of marriage and 25 years of teaching hung in the balance, along with dreams of retirement and European river cruises and growing old together in the house where they'd built their life. Bob reached for her hand again, his grip carrying the strength that had held them together through every crisis they'd faced as a team. "We'll figure this out," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Whatever it takes, however we have to do it, we'll figure this out together." But sitting in that medical office, surrounded by the evidence of her body's betrayal and their system's indifference, Maggie wondered if love and determination would be enough to overcome the mathematics of American healthcare, or if they were about to discover the exact price of a life measured in dollars and cents. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered with the casual cruelty of bureaucracy that treats human suffering as routine paperwork. Margaret stood in her kitchen, still in her bathrobe, holding the official document that gave them 30 days to bring their mortgage current or face eviction from the house where they'd built 28 years of marriage. The amount due seemed impossible. $4,847 in missed payments, late fees, and legal costs, a number that might as well have been $4 million for all their ability to produce it. Bob found her there an hour later, returned early from a construction job canceled due to weather, the notice still clutched in her trembling hands like evidence of a crime she couldn't remember committing. His work boots left muddy prints across the kitchen linoleum as he crossed to where she stood frozen by the window, the morning light cruel against the dark patches that now covered most of the left side of her face and neck. "They can't," he said after reading the notice, his voice carrying the flat disbelief of someone watching their world collapse in real time. "We've never been more than 60 days behind on anything, ever. 28 years in this house, and we missed 3 payments, Bob." Maggie's voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone older and more defeated than the woman who'd graded papers at this same kitchen table just months before, December, January, February. The cancer medication, the medical bills, my lost income, they have every right. The mathematics of their destruction laid itself out with brutal clarity. Maggie's unpaid leave from teaching had eliminated $3,200 per month in steady income. Bob's construction work, always seasonal and weather-dependent, had been particularly sparse during the unusually wet winter. The cancer medication, even with pharmaceutical assistance programs that reduced the cost to $800 per month, still represented money they didn't have. Medical bills from specialists, tests, and consultations had drained their savings account and maxed out their credit cards. "We could sell the house," Bob said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Get ahead of the foreclosure, maybe come out with a few $1,000s to start over somewhere else." But they both knew the real estate market in their small Texas town offered slim hope for homeowners facing financial crisis. Houses sat empty for months, their for sale signs fading in the sun like monuments to other families' broken dreams. Even if they found a buyer quickly, the proceeds after paying off their mortgage and the accumulated debt would barely cover first month's rent and deposits on an apartment they couldn't afford anyway. The phone calls began that afternoon, each one a fresh humiliation delivered in the polite tones of customer service representatives reading from scripts designed to extract payment from people who had no money to give. Credit card companies, medical billing services, utility companies, all of them suddenly interested in the O'Sullivan's financial situation, all of them offering payment plans and hardship programs that still required money they didn't possess. "Maybe I should stop the treatment," Maggie said that evening, the words falling into the quiet space of their living room like stones dropped into deep water. She was curled into her reading chair by the window, the one where she'd graded thousands of student papers over the years, now surrounded by medical bills and foreclosure documents instead of literary essays. Bob looked up from the bank statements he'd been studying with the desperate attention of someone searching for mathematical miracles. "Don't even think about that. Look at what it's costing us, Bob. Look at what I'm costing us." Her voice broke on the last words. 28 years of partnership, fracturing under the weight of circumstances they'd never imagined facing. "We're going to lose everything anyway. At least if I stop the medication, you'll have a house to live in after I'm gone." The silence that followed felt dangerous, filled with thoughts neither of them wanted to voice. Bob set down the bank statements and crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it with the careful movements of someone whose body carried decades of physical labor. His hands found hers, calloused fingers intertwining with her smaller ones in the gesture that had anchored them through every crisis they'd faced as a team. "Margaret O'Sullivan," he said, using her full name in the tone he'd used on their wedding day 28 years before. "I didn't marry you for your house or your income or your perfect skin. I married you because you're the strongest, smartest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and nothing, not cancer, not bills, not foreclosure, changes that. We'll live in a tent if we have to, but we're not giving up on your life to save our stuff." That night, Maggie woke at 3 in the morning to find Bob's side of the bed empty. She found him in their kitchen, laptop open on the table, surrounded by printouts and legal pads covered with his careful handwriting. He was researching bankruptcy law, disability applications, medical assistance programs, diving into bureaucratic systems he'd never had to navigate, trying to find loopholes and safety nets that might catch them before they hit bottom. "Bob, come to bed," she said softly. But he shook his head without looking up from the screen. "There has to be something," he muttered, clicking through websites with the determination of someone who believed problems could be solved through sufficient effort and research. "Some program, some option we haven't found yet. People get through this. Other families survive cancer and keep their houses. There has to be a way." But Maggie had been a teacher long enough to recognize the difference between hope and desperation, and Bob's midnight research had the frantic quality of someone drowning in information that led nowhere useful. The programs they qualified for offered partial assistance with medication costs, but nothing for mortgage payments. The disability benefit she might eventually receive would take months to process and wouldn't cover their current expenses anyway. The mathematical reality remained unchanged. They needed more money than their combined efforts could generate, for longer than their resources could sustain. The community's response to their crisis revealed both the best and worst of small-town dynamics. Mrs. Patterson from next door appeared on their porch with another casserole and an envelope containing $200 in cash. Her Social Security check, Maggie realized with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "You helped my grandson with his college applications," the elderly woman said simply. "Time for me to return the favor." But for every gesture of support, there were reminders of their isolation. Former friends who crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations about money and mortality, church members who offered prayers but avoided practical assistance. The particular cruelty of neighbors who whispered about the O'Sullivans' financial troubles while maintaining careful distance from their medical ones. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in mid-March, when Bob arrived home early to find Maggie sitting at their kitchen table with a bottle of sleeping pills and a glass of water, staring out the window at the foreclosure notice now taped to their front door by the sheriff's department. She wasn't actively suicidal. The pills remained unopened, the water untouched, but her stillness carried the weight of someone who'd reached the end of her capacity to fight. "I can't do this anymore," she said without turning around, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been running uphill for months without rest. "I can't watch you work 3 jobs and still lose everything. I can't be the reason we end up homeless. I can't keep pretending this is going to work out somehow." Bob's response surprised them both with its intensity. Instead of gentle reassurance or logical arguments, he swept the pill bottle off the table with enough force to send it clattering across the kitchen floor, then pulled Maggie from her chair and into his arms with the desperate strength of someone who'd almost lost the most important thing in his life. "You listen to me," he said, his voice rough with emotions he rarely allowed himself to express. "I've been married to you for 28 years, and I've watched you fight for every single student who walked into your classroom. You've saved more lives than you'll ever know. Kids who were ready to drop out, kids who thought they were stupid, kids who needed someone to believe in them. And now, when it's your turn to need saving, you want to quit?" Maggie pulled back to look at his face, seeing tears in eyes that had remained dry through his father's funeral, her miscarriages, and every other crisis they'd weathered together. "Bob, we're losing everything. We're losing stuff," he corrected, his grip on her shoulders gentle but firm. "Houses can be replaced, money can be earned. But you, Margaret Catherine O'Sullivan, the woman who taught me what love really means, you can't be replaced. Not by me, not by your students, not by anyone whose life you've touched." The fight went out of her then, not in defeat, but in recognition of something she'd forgotten during months of medical appointments and financial calculations. She wasn't just a cancer patient or a foreclosure statistic. She was a teacher, a wife, a woman who'd spent 25 years showing young people that difficult circumstances didn't have to define their futures. That evening, for the first time in weeks, they made love in their bedroom that might soon belong to someone else, holding each other with the desperate tenderness of people who understood that some things were worth more than the houses that contained them. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. Grace Chen's voice on the other end of the line carried an excitement that cut through Maggie's depression like sunlight through storm clouds. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I need you to sit down," the 17-year-old said with an authority that reminded Maggie why Grace had been her favorite student. "I have something to tell you, and you're not going to believe it." "Grace, sweetheart, if this is about schoolwork, I'm not really in a position to—" "It's not about schoolwork," Grace interrupted, her voice vibrating with barely contained energy. "It's about you, about what we've been doing, about what the whole school has been doing. Mrs. O'Sullivan, we've raised $47,000. The number hit Maggie like a physical blow, too large and unexpected to be processed immediately. "What are you talking about? We started a GoFundMe campaign. Help our hero teacher." Jenny Morrison set up the page. Marcus Johnson shared it on every social media platform he could find, and I've been coordinating with your former students. And Mrs. O'Sullivan, you have no idea how many lives you've touched. Alumni from 25 years of teaching have been contributing. People who graduated in 1998 and still remember how you helped them with their college essays. students who are now doctors and lawyers and teachers themselves, all because you believed in them when no one else did. Maggie sank into her kitchen chair, the phone trembling in her hand as Grace's words washed over her like a tide of unexpected grace. Through the window, she could see the foreclosure notice still taped to their door. But it no longer seemed like a final judgment, just another problem that might have a solution after all. $47,000, she repeated, testing the words to see if they remained real when spoken aloud. And growing, Grace said, her young voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd orchestrated a miracle. Mrs. O'Sullivan, did you really think you could spend 25 years saving people and not expect them to save you back? 6 months later, Margaret O'Sullivan stood before her bathroom mirror on a crisp October morning, studying the face that had become both familiar and foreign over the course of her ordeal. The dark patches that had consumed nearly half her face at their worst were now pale shadows of their former selves, fading gradually like bruises healing in reverse. Her oncologist had explained that the hyperpigmentation would continue to diminish over time, eventually leaving only the faintest traces of what they'd endured together. But the woman looking back at her was fundamentally changed in ways that had nothing to do with skin tone. Her eyes held depths they hadn't possessed before, the particular gravity that came from staring death in the face and choosing to blink first. The laugh lines around her mouth seemed deeper, earned through tears that had eventually given way to joy. She looked like someone who'd been broken apart and reassembled with stronger materials, more durable joints, foundations built to weather storms she hadn't known were coming. "Ready for the big day?" Bob called from their bedroom, his voice carrying the easy contentment of someone who'd learned to appreciate ordinary mornings after months of extraordinary fear. He appeared in the bathroom doorway, adjusting the tie he wore only for special occasions, his weathered face bright with the particular pride of someone watching his wife return to the calling that defined her. Today was Margaret's official return to Riverside High School after 8 months of medical leave, cancer treatment, and the gradual rebuilding of a life that had nearly collapsed under the weight of circumstances beyond their control. The school board had voted unanimously to welcome her back, the same parents who'd once demanded her removal now volunteering to organize a celebration assembly in her honor. The morning commute to school felt surreal. Familiar landmarks made new by the lens of survival, the same stop signs and traffic lights, the same small businesses and residential streets, but all of it somehow more vivid, more precious, seen through eyes that had been forced to consider what it would mean to leave it all behind. Bob drove her in their pickup truck, the same 15-year-old vehicle that had carried them through the darkest months of their marriage, now paid off thanks to the community fundraising that had exceeded everyone's expectations. The final tally had reached nearly $90,000, a sum that still seemed impossible, despite the bank statements that proved its reality. Former students had emerged from decades of silence to contribute and share stories of how Mrs. O'Sullivan had changed their lives. A successful software entrepreneur who'd graduated in 2001 had donated $10,000 with a note that simply said, "You taught me to debug my thinking before I learned to debug code." A military officer stationed in Germany had organized contributions from his entire unit. A young mother in California had started her own fundraising drive among her mom's group, raising $3,000 from strangers who'd never met Margaret but understood the universal language of teachers who cared. The most surprising contributor had been Dr. Elizabeth Hayes herself, who'd not only waived her consultation fees but had also made a significant personal donation to the fund. Her accompanying letter had revealed her own cancer history, a diagnosis she'd received during her medical residency, the fear and isolation she'd experienced, and her regret at not immediately recognizing the signs in Margaret's case. "I should have known," she'd written. As someone who'd walked that path myself, I should have seen what you were trying to hide. Your courage in continuing treatment while protecting your family from worry reminds me why I became a doctor, to help people fight battles they shouldn't have to fight alone. The pharmaceutical company had eventually approved Margaret for their compassionate use program, reducing the cost of her remaining treatment to manageable levels. The insurance company had reversed their denial after a legal intervention organized by the teachers' union, though the fight had taken months, and revealed the Byzantine complexity of a healthcare system that seemed designed to exhaust patients before providing care. Most importantly, Margaret's latest scans had shown no evidence of active cancer. The targeted therapy had worked exactly as Dr. Hayes had hoped, shrinking the existing tumor and preventing metastasis. She would continue on maintenance medication for another year, but the prognosis was excellent, better than 90% 5-year survival rate, numbers that had once seemed like impossible dreams, but now felt like solid ground beneath their feet. Walking through the doors of Riverside High School, Margaret was overwhelmed by the transformation of the building that had been her professional home for 25 years. Student artwork lined the hallways, not the usual collection of class projects, but specifically created pieces celebrating themes of courage, community, and overcoming adversity. A banner stretched across the main hallway reading, "Welcome back, Mrs. O'Sullivan, our hero teacher," signed by hundreds of students past and present. Her classroom had been meticulously maintained during her absence, but it had also been enhanced in ways that brought tears to her eyes. New books filled the shelves, donations from community members who'd learned about her passion for expanding her students' literary horizons. A comfortable reading chair sat in the corner where her old desk chair used to be, donated by the furniture store owner whose daughter had been one of Margaret's students 15 years earlier. But the most meaningful change was subtle. Photographs and letters from former students covered an entire wall, creating a visual testament to 25 years of teaching that had touched lives in ways Margaret had never fully understood. Grace Chen had organized the collection, reaching out through social media and alumni networks to gather evidence of impact that stretched far beyond test scores and graduation rates. The first class of the day was Advanced Placement Literature. Many of the same students who'd witnessed her mysterious transformation months earlier, now young adults who'd learned lessons about resilience and community that no textbook could teach. They greeted her return with applause that felt both overwhelming and healing, their faces bright with the particular joy of seeing someone they cared about restored to health and purpose. "So," Margaret said, settling behind her desk with the familiar comfort of someone returning home after a long, difficult journey. "Who can tell me what you learned about courage while I was away?" Grace Chen's hand shot up immediately, her expression carrying the wisdom of someone who'd organized miracles and discovered her own capacity for leadership. "We learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, Mrs. O'Sullivan. It's the decision to act despite the fear, like continuing your treatment even when it seemed impossible. Like coming back to teach us even though you didn't know if we'd accept you. Like trusting other people to help carry your burden instead of trying to bear it alone." The discussion that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced in 25 years of teaching. These students, some of whom had been frightened of her condition months earlier, now spoke with deep understanding about sacrifice, community responsibility, the difference between helping and fixing, the courage required to ask for help and the wisdom needed to offer it effectively. Marcus Johnson, typically her most reluctant participant, raised his hand near the end of class. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded, curious about what her formerly shy student wanted to know. "When you were sickest, when everything seemed hopeless, what kept you going? What made you decide to keep fighting?" Margaret paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You did," she said finally, her voice carrying the simple truth of someone who'd discovered their deepest motivations during their darkest hours. "All of you. Not just this class, but every student I've taught over 25 years. I realize that teachers don't just shape students. You shape us right back. You become part of who we are, part of what makes us want to keep being better versions of ourselves. I couldn't give up because that would mean giving up on all the connections we've built together." That afternoon, Margaret and Bob sat in their kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd received the foreclosure notice, where she'd contemplated giving up, where they'd learned the true meaning of community support. The mortgage was current, the medical bills manageable, the future no longer a source of terror but of cautious optimism. "So," Bob said, reaching across the table to take her hand in the gesture that had anchored them through 28 years of marriage and 8 months of crisis, "what do you want to do with the rest of our lives?" Margaret smiled, feeling the stretch of facial muscles that had learned to work around fading patches of hyperpigmentation in a face that now carried the map of everything they'd survived together. "I want to teach," she said simply. "I want to love you. I want to travel to Europe for our 30th anniversary. And I want to remember every single day that ordinary life is actually extraordinary. We just sometimes need extraordinary circumstances to help us see it." Outside their kitchen window, the October afternoon painted their small Texas town in shades of gold and amber, ordinary light made precious by eyes that had learned the difference between surviving and living, between existing and thriving, between fighting alone and fighting together. Margaret O'Sullivan's story isn't just about surviving cancer or overcoming financial crisis. It's about rediscovering the extraordinary within the ordinary moments we often take for granted. At 52, facing the mirror each morning became an act of courage, but it also became a reminder that our worth isn't measured by our appearance or our bank account, but by the connections we've built and the lives we've touched along the way. For those of us in our golden years, Margaret's journey speaks to a universal truth. Sometimes our greatest trials reveal our most profound blessings. Her students didn't just learn literature in her classroom. They learned that community means showing up when someone needs you, that asking for help is a sign of wisdom, not weakness, and that love multiplies when shared rather than hoarded. Bob and Margaret's marriage didn't just survive their crisis, it deepened, proving that for better or worse isn't just a wedding vow, but a daily choice to see each other through eyes of grace. Their story reminds us that at any age, in any circumstance, we have the power to choose hope over fear, connection over isolation, gratitude over bitterness. What moment in your life revealed an unexpected blessing during a difficult time? How has your community surprised you with their support when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.